Hello and welcome everyone. Very excited to be sharing with you the perspectives that we have on human rights due diligence, especially on the upstream supply chain, and very eager to learn from your experiences, your perspectives, and find that shared ground, which is often extremely important for professionals like us, like you, to enhance our learning in the field. In the next 60 minutes or so, and hopefully not 60, I'll try to keep it 45 if it goes a little bit here and there. We'll try to cover the topic of due diligence, but not only focusing on due diligence piece, but we'll take it up from an ecosystem view. But before we jump into that, uh, interesting fact, nobody would argue or disagree that the transatlantic slave trade has been one of the biggest scourge of our society. It was happening during the 16th, 17th century. There were almost 15 million people who were sold like cattle. And luckily for us, in 19th century, the slavery was formally abolished. But surprise, surprise, if you look at the victims of slavery today in the 21st century, the number is 50 million. So we've gone much beyond what the total victim population of slave trade was in the past centuries, and we've grown multiple times, almost more than doubled the victims on this topic. So how did we get this distinction? And modern slavery is again an umbrella term. Forced labor is one of the larger components of modern slavery. And today, if you look at the ILO numbers, there are about 28 million people who are victims of forced labor. And astonishingly, 60% of them are in private sector, which means the supply chains that my company, your company, our corporations, our peers are running, we are having forced labor victims in these supply chains. Often may not be in the tier 1, but as we go beyond these tiers, the incidences become much more prevalent. So how do we deal with this issue? So in the next 45 minutes, we're going to look at how the operating environment where our companies are operating has evolved, has changed. We will then look at whose responsibility, and this is a quintessential question, whose responsibility is to uphold human rights, especially in the higher tiers, in the upstream. Is it my responsibility? Is it the government's responsibility? Is it the immediate tiers responsibility? Who's responsible for it? So that is a pertinent question which has been often asked and debated. So we're going to take a look at what we know so far with all the work that has been done on this topic. We will also take a sneak peek into what are the legal as well as the international instruments asking companies like us to do due diligence, especially for our upstream supply chain. And finally, we're going to deep dive into how do we actually end up doing due diligence, not from a theoretical perspective, not from a jargonistic perspective, but purely from a practitioner's perspective. So what you'll find, you may not see an exact replica of what you'll find in methodologies or approaches of OECD and others, but you will definitely see an approach of how you can take these approach or these actions forward within the confines and constraints in which you operate, with multiple departments, conflicting priorities, suppliers who are not captive for us, and multiple other challenges and forces that act in the real environment. So first, traditionally, if we look at the businesses or the corporations, companies have always focused on topics like revenue, sales, acquiring new customers, improving the margins, new products, etc., etc. And that has been the overall view of the corporations or private sector. However, in the last, I would say 15 years or so, there has been a shift wherein we see a lot of regulations coming in and across the region. So, it doesn't matter, it's not only one region, but across the board, we see several legislations coming in, which have, interestingly, a common theme. All of these legislations ask the customers, companies like us, to be accountable for our suppliers' sustainability performance. They don't talk about commercials, they don't talk about quality, but they say that if you are a customer, you are managing a global supply chain, or you are an important part of a global supply chain, you need to be accountable for how your suppliers are behaving and acting in their day-to-day operations. And it doesn't matter whether my company has a presence in the country where my supplier is located or not, I'm still legally accountable for those performances. Now, come to think of it, how did this transformation or how did this shift come along? And it's not very difficult to understand why. If you look at the news, if you look at the media, if you look at the coverage which is happening around us, there is n number of sources which cite real examples of how violation, how exploitation, how the basic dignity of human beings is being violated across the global supply chains. Sometimes it's the emerging economies who have been traditionally considered, oh, these are the issues, you deal with them. But no. Of late, we are seeing even mature economies facing the situations where even some of the very basic safeguards and thresholds are being compromised. Sometimes, it's companies who are not aware, they are probably think it cannot happen here. Sometimes by very much design. So the law are being repealed, the law are being, let's say, revisited to make sure that institutional safeguards which have been there for a very long period of time, they are tweaked, and certain practices which were unacceptable in the past come within the realm of acceptable practices. And this is something which calls for us to urgently relook at how do we as organizations, as corporations, look at the human rights topic, not just within our factories, within our offices, not just our tier one suppliers, but entire value chain. Because these tweaks, these modifications, these rollbacks could be happening anywhere, and it could impact or make us liable. In fact, some of the developments in the past, and it's the most recent development has been in the month of May in 2025, where we have seen instances of customers or parent companies being taken to court in their home countries, which means if I am a company who's headquartered in France, and if there is an entity or a supplier in another country who has done some malpractice, I may be taken to court in France. And just this month, the UK Supreme Court rejected the application of one of the consumer electrical goods company and gave the green light to let the court be run in the UK for the practices where their suppliers, who were located in Malaysia, were involved in modern slavery and forced labor, while this company was headquartered in the UK. We had similar instances earlier. It happened in case of Shell. It happened in case of Vedanta. So now we are increasingly seeing there is a legal precedent wherein if you as a customer do not do your own due diligence, if you have an oversight on some of the malpractices, you could be held liable in the countries where there is a much stronger jurisdiction, much stronger law, and an accountability mechanism in place. Now, if we look at all of this change and the incidents which are happening, how do we make sense of it? Well, there are certain things which we need to factor in if we have to put all of these developments in perspective. First of all, there is no debate that we have breached the planetary boundaries and the societal boundaries. The numbers are out there. These are researches done by very reputed agencies, starting from the UN to various academic institutions, who say that we definitely have not, let's say, delivered in terms of the social good, in terms of the economic good, as we could have when we talk about the trade and commerce. So definitely there is a genuine case for us to be concerned. But at the same time, we are living in a world which is hyper transparent, with the speed of media, the news, so many instruments which can communicate the instance which happened in one place to the other part of the world, even before I would have had a chance to react or respond to them. And half of the world knows and is talking about it. This hyper transparency has created a much stronger emphasis and pressure to respond. Customers, end users, governments, they are seeing things. It's not like something bad has happened and it's hidden. It's out there in front of everyone, documented with videos, photographs, imageries, etc. And hence, there is a much stronger demand for governments, for corporations to act on it. Now we leave aside corporations for a moment, but when this demand goes to the governments, how do they respond? They respond by coming up with newer legislations. Of course, it takes time. The legislations don't come up, in a jiffy and in a short span of time, but at least the ball starts rolling in that direction. And this has been happening for almost a decade and a half, good part of it wherein these instances have been documented. In fact, in the previous slide, the instances that we saw, that's a result of all the news, the media, the hyper transparent world that we live in. Once you've seen it, you cannot unsee it. And once we start seeing regulatory requirements coming in, these requirements being embedded into the regulatory regime, the customers and the investors start becoming aware of this and start taking cognizance. Because then it no longer stays a good to have thing, it becomes a resilience issue. If my supply chain is not adhering, not responding to some of the legislations which has been passed in some of the countries, there is a very real risk of me facing a disruption. My supplier getting locked, my supplier getting sanctioned or other sources. So this has resulted in a very strong interest from a lot of customers going back to their suppliers and incorporating, asking these questions as early as in the request for interest stage, the RFIs which are being sent. We, as Schneider Electric, receive RFIs wherein customers ask, do you have controls and preventive measures for these instances or these regulations? How are you taking care of things not only in your operations, but in your supply chains? Because we know you operate an extensive supply chain. So we have to share with our customers a lot of these insights on how we are engaging our suppliers, processes, etc., etc. And slowly we see it's not just us, it's not just one company, but the entire industry starts reacting, responding, and we see the threshold increasing. So if we have to compare what used to be earlier, if you go back 15 years, 20 years, if I used to take care of things within my factory, within my premises, within my offices, and there is no problem with that, I was safe. That was the best thing I could do. But no longer today, because today, as a corporation, I need to take end-to-end ownership of my value chain. On one hand, I need to make sure that I have the visibility going up to the mines, and in certain specific commodities, it is actually true. I need to make sure that nothing bad is happening right from the mining to the smelting to the processing to the trading and till the time it reaches me. So that part. To the other end, wherein once the consumer has used my product has passed the use phase, it has gone to the end of the life phase, and it is I have to be accountable whether it is going to end up in the landfill, increase the waste load in the planet on the planet. Are there toxic chemicals, toxic substances which will eventually leach out and damage the environment or the health of the people who are involved in the recycling industry or scavenging industry? This is the new reality. This is the new normal in which I, as a corporation, has to operate. And we will see in the next coming slides, there are regulations, there are laws which explicitly mandate me to do so. So it no longer is an optional question. It no longer is a matter of choice whether I want to do or not. It's mandated by law. But then again, this kind of question, this kind of thing, it takes a lot of effort and conversation to, to overcome. The mental barrier on this topic is huge. That is why, despite all what we see, all what we experience, there will still be companies who will ask, oh, is it really my responsibility? Should it not be, the government's responsibility to do this? I should be focusing on running my business, or like, what all things should I have to take care of, So this question is not a new question today. This question has been asked for almost 20, 25 years now. And in fact, uh, the ex-Secretary General of United Nations, late Mr. Kofi Annan, he established a commission led by Professor John Ruggie of Harvard University to ponder and dwell on this question and come up with an answer. So what Professor Ruggie did was he spent a couple of years, spoke to numerous people. Of course, he had a team of professionals to work with him. They spoke with different stakeholders, corporations, individuals, civil societies, and all sorts of stakeholders. They spoke, they analyzed a lot of perspectives, views, they looked at the laws, etc., etc. And then they eventually came out with something that we today know as the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. What do they say? They say that no doubt states or the governments have the duty to protect the human rights of every individual within their jurisdiction, especially if there are violations that are committed by companies. So how do they need to do? They defined an infrastructure around it. States should create laws at a domestic level which should prevent these actions from happening. They should also empower their enforcement agencies so that in case if there is any incidence of violation, there can be a fair investigation into the violations, and then they should have mechanism to punish the people who are responsible for it, and there should be a redressal mechanism. So protection is no doubt the responsibility of the state or the government. However, corporations also have a responsibility here, and that is to respect the human rights irrespective of the fact whether the governments can protect those rights or not. Which means I cannot come up with an excuse that I'm operating in X country and the government or the governance mechanism is not robust enough. So I'm going to go and indulge in violations and exploitation. But when I operate in a geography, in a country where there is a strong rule of law, I'm going to follow everything. This dichotomy in the corporate behavior has to stop. And this is what is the clear answer from the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. It also goes on to tell how do we do it, because just saying that you have to do is not enough. And this is where the due diligence actually gets embedded in our DNA. The guiding principles say that in order to respect the human rights, irrespective of the country or the governance mechanism that you may have, you have to do a couple of things. First, as a corporation, you need to know the impact of your operations in whichever geography you are or you are impacting. And that goes across the multiple tiers of supply chain, not just tier 1, but tier 2, tier X, up to the mines. Second, once I know what are the potential harms that can actually happen because of my operations or my actions or my demand, I need to prevent those infringements. I need to put in mechanisms, policies, and processes which should prevent, which should hold those guardrails, and there should not be any violation. And in case if there is, then there should be a remediation. And finally is the remediation mechanism. So this entire framework, which is given by the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, is called Protect, Respect, and Remedy Framework. Now, what does remedy entail? Remedy calls for the state as well as the corporations to have the processes which, if there is a detection or a complaint of any malpractice or any violation, we should try to reverse the harm by putting in appropriate mechanisms and reduce the loss which has happened to the extent it is possible. So this was in fact one of the first formal approaches which talked about the due diligence extending right up to the upstream of the value chain. Closely, OECD also came out with their guidelines for multinational enterprises, focusing on the responsible business conduct. And they also emphasized on a similar model of due diligence, saying companies need to know the impact of their operations. We can't just simply go and start working and not have any idea of the impact it's going to have on the people, on the communities, on the environment. So we need to know all of that. It's pretty much like we do a market analysis, a market research before launching a product. In the same fashion, we have to look at the impact as well. And then we need to ensure there are precautions. And then we need to roll our actions. If you need to look at the frameworks, what needs to be done in a more accurate and precise, I would say, a formal way, these two documents are extremely good reference. They are readily available on internet. Please feel free to download them and have a look. OECD due diligence framework, there are two documents. One is the multinational guidelines. The other is a dedicated addendum on how to conduct the due diligence guidelines. So these two come in a pair. So these two developments, or let's say guards that we talked about, they are international. They are not legal per se, but they are driven by moral authority of what should be done, but they do not have the force of law. What has the force of law are some of these instruments. Some of it are already in place, in force, and some of them will be. So starting with the French duty of vigilance law, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, the German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act, the Norwegian Transparency Act. These are all the laws which are enshrined in the legal framework, and they ask companies to do the due diligence, often ask companies to publish these findings of the due diligence. What are the malpractices? How have we remediated them, etc., etc. So there is a legal framework in many countries, often existing, often going beyond the geographical boundaries. Some of it, which are not legal or in pipeline, come from Japan, Canada, Netherlands, Swiss Roundtable Business Initiative. There is a counter proposal which got adopted, and the UN Binding Treaty on Business and Human Rights, which is still in the draft stage. So if you have business which is touching in some of these geographies, some of these regions, then you might legally be obligated to conduct due diligence within your operations, within your supply chains. Now, these are going beyond human rights. Now, due diligence is a process, actually. It could be done for human rights. It could be done for ecological impact. It can be used in any which areas. These are some of the regulations going outside the human rights domain, typically from the environmental side. These are all proposed legislation. Some of it are already there, like CBAM is already there, but some of it, the eco design regulation, they are going to come. They also mandate the similar approach, a similar work as due diligence. You need to identify the supply chain actors, you need to assess the information, the impact, and disclose it as part of your disclosure or response to these regulations. So what we discussed today is how our operating environment changed from just focusing on commercial activity to the economic impact around the society, and how the regulations, the law, both soft law, hard law, have evolved. Now, this is not a new thing. This has been happening for about 10 to 15 years now. What is the reality today? Are we ready to respond to these requirements? Unfortunately, not. This, in the best, I would say largely in the best case scenario, this is what companies are actually ready to deal with. If you look at any corporation, they would almost certainly have a responsible sourcing program. They will be doing their ESG audits, reaching out to the suppliers. They will have sustainability reports talking about how many audits, where all, et cetera, et cetera. But this is not enough, and this is not due diligence. For due diligence, this is the view that we need to take. And I'm not even talking about the downstream side of it. It's the upstream, which is our topic. So I'm limiting here. Different industries have got different levels of success. Some cases, some value chains which are not as complex, we do see some degree of traceability, some degree of visibility. But for a lot of value chains, especially raw materials, electronics, plastics, even agriculture, we do not see this visibility or this maturity in the businesses today, which means beyond the tier one, there is a lot of intermixing, blending, spot purchases, etc., etc. And from there onwards, I lose the sight of the actors, the impact, and what is the flow of the raw material, which is coming either into my product directly or reaching into my tier one supplier, because a lot of times I buy products or I use products which I don't purchase. My supplier has purchased, it's there in that product, and I purchase that product. Critical minerals like lithium, cobalt, nickel, the whole focus on these minerals is a very big example of this kind of trade. So traditionally, we do not have this visibility in large number of sectors. So what can we do to embed the human rights within the policies and the processes? Now, what I'm going to share about, as I mentioned earlier, is a simplified version, more of a common person's language of how we conduct due diligence, especially on the topic of human rights. But the process remains the same. You can do the same activity for other processes or other topics, ecological impact as well. It's more or less the same thing. The process and the framework is same. It's a six-step process. It is something which is taken from the OECD framework or the other references. I mean, there is no other way, or my own insight or Schneider's own insight on this. This is what we've learned from the developments that have happened in the past. So there are 6 steps, and we need to take these steps one by one in a cyclical manner. So we start by identifying what is a typical value chain for my organization. Now, if I am in procurement or if I am in a corporate department managing sustainability, often the knowledge of my visibility of my value chain will end either after tier 1 or max tier 2. In very exceptional cases, or maybe it is driven by commodity or category strategy, I would know where the raw materials are eventually coming from. It could be there in some sectors as well, but largely speaking, across industrial sector, this is what we have found. So what we need to do when we look at the upstream side first, we need to make sure that we are first of all not alone in this activity. We need to find someone who is from the procurement department, who is aware and knowledgeable about the different commodities that are being purchased in the company. If I talk about Schneider Electric, there are more than 85 categories of goods and services which are purchased. So I cannot, let's say, replicate this exercise just by talking with one person. So I need to identify, I need to do some analytics. I need to identify what are the different commodities I purchase. I need to rank or prioritize them, which are the ones by volume, by dependency. There are various metrics that could be used. But once I have prioritized out of all, then I go on to see who is the person in procurement who is responsible for those purchases. And then I need to set up a call with them to understand the upstream value chain. And my visibility of the value chain will only be as good as my procurement colleagues' visibility. Ideally, what I should be doing, I should be trying to identify who all are my tier 1 suppliers, what are my tier 2 suppliers, where are the tier 3 suppliers, or if I don't know the name or the entities, I should be knowing which are the regions or geographies where these tier 2, tier 3 concentration is happening. At this stage, any information is good information. There is no prerequisite, there is no standard template that this is what I have to follow or I should get an answer. This is a very I would say, nascent exploration across industries. And a lot of times, what the information, the response you're going to get will be unstructured. You have to build upon, with each step. So don't complain, don't feel bad if you're not getting information. Probably it's, a lot of other companies are also in the same boat. But we need to build upon and we need to start going beyond. Technically, if we have to look at the entire value chain, we need to replicate the same for downstream as well. We need to identify someone from the sales side of the organization or the front office, identify and get a sense of the distribution channels, where are the consumer markets, how they are being distributed, etc., etc. So map it on a geographical map. What are the hotspots? What are the regions? What kind of commodity hotspot I am seeing in the geographical map? So that is something which needs to be created. It will require fair amount of analysis of your databases, spend databases, purchase databases, fair amount of interaction. So a mix and match of all these activities. Once you have identified or mapped the value chain, then you sit down to identify. And here again, the key thing is not to think we will be able to map everything. It builds, gradually. So start identifying or putting names and putting the companies, identifying the companies as and when you move, you get the visibility. But do not limit your stakeholder identification only to the commercial actors, because stakeholders, and especially when we talk about human rights due diligence, it is done not from the perspective of a company, it is done from the perspective of the person who is impacted. Which means if we are talking about a worker in my supply chain, you have to think from that worker's perspective. It is a community who is impacted by dislocation because of the mining which is happening. You have to think from the perspective of the community who is getting displaced. So what we have here and what you see is typical stakeholder groups that we find across value chain. More or less, it would remain same for any company. What differs is when you start putting names, putting geographies, putting the identification and recognizing them who these stakeholders are. This is what makes this dead template a live template, something which is customized for your operations, for your business. So once we have mapped the value chain and identified the stakeholders, next thing that we need to do is prioritize. What are the issues that are associated with them? Now, in this case, we are talking about human rights due diligence, so we're going to focus on the human rights issues. But like I said earlier, it could be done for other topics as well. Now, what you have again here mapped is typically what are the common issues which are associated with different stakeholder groups. So when you talk about upstream, there would be compliance with respect to your suppliers. When you come talk about workers in your suppliers, the working conditions. No, you can. So this is at a very high level. So I'm just saying working conditions. But then if you deep dive, if you investigate further, which ideally is the next step, then you will get to know, is excessive working hours a problem with that particular group of suppliers? Is it non-payment of wages, underpayment of wages? Is it migrant workers, retention of passport, money for employment? Are these the issues, or what is the issue? So there needs to be an engagement with the stakeholder group. And similarly, if you have minerals, metals, these kind of substances in your value chain mapping, ideally, we need to understand where those minerals are extracted, who are the communities around those places, what is the impact they are facing, and how we can exert our pressure to rectify that. So this template remains the same, but you need to go deeper and customize this template basis your specific business, your specific operations, your specific supply chain realities. Someone may ask here, okay, but it looks like too big a topic, and how do I start with? I don't have a team, I don't have people in those countries. I'm sitting in my office and I'm just probably a very small team either, or just one person who's responsible. So how do I start? I can't. Um, I think this question is more of a psychological barrier for us rather than an actual roadblock. Because if you look at For this kind of analysis, what we are trying to do, you have to split it into two sections. One is a secondary literature, and the second is actual stakeholder feedback. Now, what happens in secondary literature? It's nothing but a glorified name for a simple Google search. So if I am using nickel in my products and I know that I am part of a nickel value chain and I want to understand what's happening on nickel, I just need to go on to Google. I need to search impact of nickel mining or trends of nickel, boom, etc., etc. Types keywords. Within few clicks, you will find or you will be able to identify, at least at a high level, what are the geographical hotspots where there is too much activity, what kind of risks are there, what kind of impacts communities are facing, etc., etc. A lot of groundwork has already been done by a lot of brave researchers, news media person, other colleagues who are actually living on the ground. And what we need to do is we need to take the work that they have done and incorporate into the work that we are doing. So we need to carry that message forward. Not necessarily we need to go onto the ground. I mean, we may need to, but not at this stage. So two steps for identifying the salient human rights risks or material human rights risk or prioritizing the human rights risk. Start with an internet search. If it is suppliers in manufacturing supply chain and you know what are the geographical hotspots, do a simple search on the labor rights violations, labor rights conditions in XYZ country. You'll get a huge amount of literature to begin your journey. All that falls under your secondary literature. Now, if you are ready to move to the next step, and if you can, try to reach out to the stakeholders and get the direct feedback from them. You may need to do a little groundwork, structure the questionnaires. It cannot be a simple me going out and asking, okay, what has happened? There has to be a little process and consideration in how do we create those questionnaires, who administers those questionnaire. Trust is a very important factor. So all those things need to be put in place. So the stakeholder feedback, if we are getting directly, that is something which becomes more important and a little more I would say formal activity. And then we put all of this into a chart. It could be a 2x2. I prefer 2x2, but it could be a 4x4, 3x3, depending upon, and it has to be an X and Y. So X could be the risk of the geographies and the impact or the process, depending upon what works or what makes sense for me. And then once I have plotted the risks among the different coordinates or different quadrants, I can pick up the ones which are the most pertinent, most important ones, and plot them in a template which talks about the likelihood, the severity, the extent in terms of how many people are impacted, and whether the impact can be reversed or not, which is the remediability. So remediability is reversing the harm to make the situation as it was original. Maybe it could be done for a land reclamation, but it cannot be done if a person loses a limb in a machine because you cannot grow the arm back. So that is the extent of, that is the measure of remediability. Now, for each of the stakeholder groups, I have to do this kind of analysis and then I need to map it. And this could very well be, as a first step, a qualitative analysis. It doesn't need to have very fancy quant or statistical measures. In fact, go ahead with the qualitative measure, have a qualitative focus group discussion, and basis that try to assign whether it is high, max, extremely severe, low severity, medium severity, likewise. So this, once you have identified or once you've done the exercise, you have your list of salient issues that we should be looking at in our company. Now, timing also matters. If we are doing it after the activities have been done, it doesn't necessarily always qualify as a due diligence process, because due diligence is proactive, it is before you actually do. But nonetheless, we can't just, stop our business, roll back, do it, and then start. So it's better to start from whichever place we are able to. The second last step, or in fact, the third last step here is, once you have identified the issues, then you plot it in your organizational chart. Which is the department in whose umbrella this issue falls? If it is something related with safety, it would be the operations or manufacturing department. If it is worker rights, it would be human resources. If it is worker rights in supply chain, it would be procurement. And often for the upstream, it will more or less always be procurement. So we need to be mapping, with what is the boundary that we are looking at. And once we have mapped these departments with these issues, then we need to put in an analysis of the existing systems, policies, and processes within the company or within that particular department, and see whether this department has a provision or the policies have a provision to manage and address these issues which have been identified. If not, then there is a need to incorporate and put in. What I share with you here is a snapshot from Schneider Electric, my company, how we look at the comparison of the different risk categories, what kind of policies we have, what are the public policies, what are the non-public policies, and then we just do not need to stop at having the name of the policy, but we need to deep dive and review the policy, whether it is meeting those provisions and risks, addressing those risks or not. Once we have identified, so this piece is going to take time. And that's why the due diligence, if you want to do it thoroughly, it will take time. You have to space it out, you have to phase it out, and it will take a bit of time to conclude in a proper manner. Finally, once we have identified that there are gaps, it needs to be filled in, we need to make sure there is accountability within the organization. There is a remediation process. And for that, we need to make sure it's not just a sustainability department and ESG department who's responsible for everything. We need to connect the responsibility and accountability with the businesses, with the board, with the executive leadership, and with the functional leadership. Due to paucity of time, I'll not be able to go into the details of this, but this is how, again, referencing Schneider Electric, right from the board level up to the shop floor level, the accountabilities are fixed or the governance are fixed so that people know that it is their responsibility to address these requirements. And then once we put in mechanisms, it's about tracking the performance and monitoring. Having said that, these are some of the questions which people still ask. Munur, I don't know if I should stop because this is my last slide. If I should stop, or you want me to overcome, and or we can take these in the question and answer as well. I leave it up to you.
Yes, I'll let you finish your point, and then just to, conscious of time, just to leave some time at the end for some
Sure.
questions from everyone.
So, having said all of this is great. I mean, but still people say, hey, I'm 7 to 8 years away from my, from the first instance of intervention, which is happening at mine. And there is a lot of mixing, blending, spot purchases, especially in commodity market. It's happening a lot. If you're dealing with metals and minerals, then there are furnaces which mix everything, smelters which combine everything. So how do you do the tracking and tracing? It's overwhelming, and I oftentimes may not even have a leverage with my upstream suppliers for various reasons. I may be 10 levels, away from them without any direct contact, or they may be multiple times bigger than me because I'm just an end consumer, penultimate to consumer company. What to do in those cases? So in those situations, what we see is there are three kinds of interventions which come in, and then they are like, if you run through each of these points, they are, the first thing is, if you have very strict limitations, if you feel nothing could be done, at least start speaking up. Come out with a policy, come out with a process, include this in your communication with your suppliers. There will, at any point of time, there will be some group of supplier on which you will have leverage. You will have a contact. You will know how things are being done. If you cannot map the entire value chain or the upstream, start with tier one. Start small. That's still a good approach, and mature on this journey. Another thing is, if the earlier experience or the earlier example, if there is a big corporation intermixing happening, I don't have visibility, what do I do? The best thing then in that case is have your own process, have your own position, but then rather than doing something on your own, try to identify if there is an industry initiative in your sector. There are several industry initiatives which work on due diligence, which work on upstream supply chain mapping, which work on similar topics. There are industry standards. So if you talk about mining, there are industry standards like IRMA, like Coppermark, like Responsible Steel. You can become a supporter and augment the demand for accountability. If you can do nothing, you can speak, you can increase the demand for these requirements. If you can do more, subscribe to these industry initiatives. If you do not know where exactly these are happening, try to come up again with some initiatives which do not reach out to your supplier. And this is the last piece. So sometimes reaching the supplier might not be possible. In that case, focus on the geography and associate with initiatives which are happening in that geography. So I'll pause here. I know the last bit I rushed kind of because of the pressure, but Manur, I hand over back to you in case if there are any questions or there is any reflection that any of our colleagues would like to share. And I'll stop sharing now.
Yes.